Welcome to one of the few things you can completely rely on, especially at the moment, Alan Robson's Grizzly Tales. Now, in the past few months, we've talked about pets that have been known to kill you. And every year, somebody on some television program is asked the question, what's the most deadly animal on the planet? And to everybody's surprise, it seems to be the hippopotamus, who kill you by accident, but you're still equally dead. However, a guy called Graham Anderson, who lives in Throckley, sent me a note saying, what animals really do kill you? Which are the ones you particularly got to look out for? Well, obviously there's a lot, and a great many of us would love to go anywhere at the moment, but particularly safaris. Oh, blimey, always fancied a safari, and yet this is kind of like going to an animal's restaurant and being a piece of steak waved in front of their nose. So, let's have a look at it. First of all, the one thing we must tell you and warn you about is, if you happen ever to go on safari and you're wandering through the jungle or the undergrowth and you see a hyena. Now, according to Disney cartoons, they just laugh a lot. In The Lion King, they were quite threatening, but you needed about 20 of them to be threatening enough. However, you've got to be really careful about hyenas, because they want you alive and they want to eat you while you're still alive so that the blood can flow and they can drink it. They don't kill you in any kind of speed at all. They take the time and tear off lumps that they know would be tasty but not fatal. So you've got to watch out for the hyena, and nobody warns you about those suckers. So let's have a look at some of the other beasts just to watch out for when you are out and about, because I have to tell you, there's a lot of scary things out there. Let me tell you about one that you might not even have thought about. If you should go to Africa, there's a buffalo with two curved horns, and they're called Cape buffaloes. Now, they're often considered to be particularly dangerous because if one should take a dislike to you, they can chase you at least 30 miles an hour, up to 34 miles an hour, some say, and some of them can weigh over 100 stone in weight. So if that should butt you in your butt, you would stay down and they could then trample you to death. But if they hit you, boy, you're going to know about it. And what people also don't tell you about these huge buffalo critters, they actually lie in wait for you. They stalk you. And they're even more aggressive if they've been wounded. And they will attack anybody or anything that's anywhere near their herd. And if they want to kill you, they use their horns to gore you while you're on the ground. And they usually take your life the very first time they hit you. They don't need to come back and do it again. So let's take a look at the obvious suspect. Hippopotamuses. Well, whenever you see them in the Attenborough documentaries, they're always lolling about in the mud, lolling about in the water. They seem to be completely benign and harmless, but if you catch them when you surprise them or you catch them on land, you'll be surprised to know that these great big dollopy things can run at 18 miles an hour. And most people that have been attacked by a hippo are dead because of their enormous teeth and the snapping of those two jaws. They can leave puncture wounds in your skin as deep and as wide as a lager can. Now, you don't want to hear that, do you? Yes, they spend most of the time in the water, but when they come out and you just happen to be walking past the riverbank, or if they're surprised, they will chase you and take your life. Okay, we all love The Lion King. We've all tried to sing the song badly. Lion's king of the jungle. And will they kill a human being? Yeah, if they're hungry enough. You got to remember that lions, up to 30 stones, which is 3 times the weight of a massive Great Dane, they can run almost as fast as a greyhound, and they have attacked people. And usually they kill them because when they attack human beings, they go for their head and they bite their head first. People could survive, but if they don't get medical attention immediately, they will get an infection that is almost certain to kill them too. They would attack humans in the same way they attack prey in the wild, hiding, leaping out, surprising, killing, and dragging off the bodies to eat. Other animals you're warned of: leopards. I know they're smaller than lions. They're really only as big as the biggest of our dogs, but they're just as dangerous as lions. They only weigh about 5 stone, but they can hide in trees, they can lie flat on the ground, and they have a sharper bite, and they're much quicker on the ground than lions. They also kill the same way that lions do. They go for the neck to rip the throat out to stop their prey from moving. And a lot of leopards have killed human beings all the way back to prehistory. But they claim that they'll only attack if their personal space is being invaded. However, if you're in the jungle, that's where they live, that's their personal space. Therefore, what the hell are you doing there in the first place? Some safari experts claim that if a leopard attacks you, you will be dead much faster than if it was a lion or pretty much any other creature. They claim that you could be dead before you even hit the ground, and then your body would be carried usually up a tree to keep other predators away from the flesh, and you would be torn apart once you were dragged up onto one of the higher branches. Now, there's a couple of other things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. One is a Cape hunting dog. In the southern part of Africa, you find these things. Further north, you find similar creatures known as jackals. Now, you see this animal, and it looks a bit like a slightly taller fox. It's got a little bit of wolf about it, but it's more foxy. And they look like quite nice dogs. Now, because in Britain we love our dogs, well, you would be tempted to go up and give one a pat. Don't. Small people, and especially lots and lots of little children, have been ambushed by these creatures and dragged out into the long grass and eaten. If someone falls, if somebody bangs their head, if somebody's asleep, the dogs will circle you, take lots of bites out of you, and then once the victim's on the ground unable to move, they pounce and they take out your throat, they take out your wrists so that you are bleeding to death and watching as all of these animals bury their muzzles into your open stomach to eat the juicy bits inside. Another one you tend to keep out of the way of anyway is the rhinoceros. And a lot of these creatures travel completely on their own. However, if they've got young with them, they will attack anything, and they'll not just attack your Land Rover, they'll come for you too. And they are also travelling at 30 miles an hour, and it's hard to escape from them because it's like being chased by a bus. Their horns, that can be between 3 and 5 feet in length, enough to impale you, and if they did, you would pretty certainly be dead. The horns are sharp enough to take your life. They can also smell you. And yes, they will probably give you a warning, they will screech and scream, but if you're nowhere near a tree and you can't get out of the way, you will be trampled to death and probably impaled. We hear by most wildlife experts that rhinoceros, not kind of a species that would look to cause people any harm. But once again, if you're near where they live, if you're near where their young are, they will likely go for you. And the same could be said of the other monster of the undergrowth, elephants. We've all watched them on television. Maybe a few of you have been lucky enough to see them in the wild. But we're talking about animals that can be up to 350 stone. So they just got to step on you. They've just got to nudge you against a wall and you're dead. They've got more ways to kill us than pretty much anything else in the wild. They've got tusks, and people have been impaled on tusks. Others have been literally slapped to death by their trunks because they have beaten people down and then been trodden on. Trampling you is probably the most common, and all over Africa and India there are thousands of stories of elephants charging through towns and villages and killing men, women and children. Some say, well, it's not on purpose, but if you're in the way, you will be equally dead. There are another species that will attack if they feel that you're invading what they consider to be their space. There's even stories of people who are clearing away the jungle to make farms and what have you. And elephants will come back to that place where they have fed before. And if the food's no longer there, they go on the rampage and flatten farm buildings and farm people if they happen to be walking around. So once again, you've got to be a little bit careful. Now, obviously, if you see an elephant and you should think, oh, it's coming my way, I'll jump in the river. Not a great idea. Piranha fish, yeah, there's some of them in some rivers. Crocodiles is probably one of the biggest reasons. We've heard of alligators in Florida taking children even on Disney sites. But the crocodile is considered one of the deadliest creatures on the entire continent of Africa. Over 1,000 people in the Nile area alone dying each year due to a crocodile attack. They can leap out of the water up to 30 feet in one jump. They can run on the land about 18 to 20 miles an hour for short distances. And remember what their mouths look like. 66 super sharpened teeth, an incredible jaw strength that can hold you while they drag you under the water and drown you. And once you've been drowned, they leave you underwater till your body bloats up, and then they simply start tearing your limbs off and your head. And they don't chew, you see. They rip bits off and then just swallow you whole, and it's their acid in their stomach that breaks you down. But crocodiles are an ambush predator. Usually you never see them until it's too late. They grab at a limb, they'll twist you, pull you under the water, and you would think you would die of the puncture wounds, but you usually drown. Anybody that has survived a crocodile attack has usually lost a hand, an arm, or a leg, or they've got a chunk out of them big enough to make sure they never go anywhere near the water ever again. Now we're becoming expert on viruses and virology and all that kind of stuff. We've had lots of lessons, some we believe, some we don't, but that's how it goes. And yet I remember the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan standing up internationally and giving a speech saying that snake bites kill over 80,000 people every year, and probably an awful lot more that are not reported, and described it as the biggest public health crisis that you've never heard of. You know, we hear about Ebola virus killing 11,000 people and terror spreads across the world. Well, 8 times that amount, more than that, die every year because of snakes. And they're terrifying things. Now, we could go through lists after list of snake, but let me just tell you what the most fierce snake is. It's the inland taipan. Now, this has enough toxin in a single bite to kill over 100 people, or 250,000 little furry critters. That's in one single bite. Black mambas have been known to kill a lion. So the most deadly snakes, there's probably half a dozen that would fit into that category. And let me share you their names just so that you know about it. The saw-scaled viper. Now, we have vipers in Britain. Not really too scary because we can pretty much always get to a hospital. So you'll be uncomfortable, you'll not feel very well, but you'll probably survive. The saw-scaled viper you find in India and the Middle East. Its venom isn't particularly strong, but the viper lives where human beings live. It lives under their floorboards, in their walls. It comes out and bites, and sometimes the people don't even know they've been bitten. The stuff of nightmares is, of course, the king cobra. Now, the king cobra has enough neurotoxin in its bite to kill an Indian elephant, and that's the area where it lives. It also has been known to be responsible for up to 50% of all human snake bites. They can be up to 18 feet long, and it is the world's biggest venomous snake. When I was out in Singapore and Thailand telling the story, Ted's story in fact, an incredible World War II story about a couple of guys from Scotland and the north of England, an award-winning story that you can download from robsonsworld.com. When I was over there, I was standing doing the story, and in front of me, about 10 feet away, a king cobra slithered past me. Didn't give me any notice whatsoever. Didn't care that I was there, just scuttled past. I thought it was amazing until I looked around and saw that everybody that was with me was about 30 yards away. Incredible looking creatures, scary as hell. If you live in Australia and Tasmania, there's a lot of stuff over there that'll kill you. But the snake that'll do it is the tiger snake. Southern Australia, you find them also in Tasmania. They've got a mixture of neurotoxins. They've got coagulants that'll stop your blood from merging, hemolycins, myotoxins. Nasty, nasty, keep out the way. We mentioned the taipan being the most fierce. It's also known as the fierce snake. It can kill a human being in less than an hour, and it has a venom that paralyzes the victim, causing the blood to hemorrhage. It makes your muscle tissues weak, and you just lie there waiting to die, unable even to tell somebody that you need help. Now, if you're a swimmer, and I must admit I've been lucky or unlucky enough to see one of these in the Pacific while I was plodging. Now, I'm not a swimmer, but I was having a plodge, and this snake went past me in the water. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought, wow, how cool is that? A snake swimming. However, when you get out, mention this to some of the hotel staff, and they said, oh, you gotta keep away from them, because they were actually faint banded sea snakes. And a lot of people say that they're even more venomous than the taipan. It says it's 100 times more deadly than the inland taipan. It's the sea swimming equivalent. And they swim in the seas off the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And it's known to rarely bite humans, unlike the inland one. And the sixth most deadly of all snakes sounds like a dance, but it's a merry dance if it bites you. The black mamba, the fastest, the quickest, speediest snake in the world. It can move of speeds, now this is for a snake, writhing on the ground, of 12.5 miles an hour. That's 5 meters a second. So it can kill a human being in less than 30 minutes. It's got fangs that once they're in, doesn't just inject you once, it keeps injecting you. And with each bite, a huge amount of neurotoxic venom that will kill you within 30 minutes. Now, even in Britain, how many of you, if bitten by a snake with modern day traffic and all of that, how many of you reckon you could get to a hospital and treated in 30 minutes? Add to the fact that you're going to be fairly paralysed at the time, so you need somebody else to know that. Scary just to think about. However, something else we're terrified of: insects and spiders. Let's start with our 8-legged, 6-eyed friends. And one of the worst arachnid is the Brazilian wandering spider. Now, yes, as the name suggests, it's very similar to one they've got in America called the American wolf spider, but its venom is much more toxic. They crawl into comfy places at night, and that could be the crick of your back, the crick of your neck, under your arm. They've also been found in fruits and flowers that we collect. It'll only bite you if it's alarmed or startled or aggravated. And if you're in bed and you feel something kind of moving around and you close your arm and threaten it, its painful bite will paralyze the muscle that it bites. Deaths have occurred even after they've been given the anti-venom. Children are more sensitive to their bites because they play on the ground, and children have weaker immune systems. Death can occur within minutes. Now, everybody's heard of the black widow spider, and you see them because on the back there's a red hourglass kind of shape. 5% of all of the reported bites from a black widow were fatal, because their favourite place to build a web is in a toilet. 63 deaths in the US within 10 years, most outside around wood piles or in the toilet. Black widow bites today, because most houses have indoor toilets, are very, very rare. But the bite, if you're bitten, looks horrific. It can cause muscle ache, sickness, paralysis of your diaphragm, stopping your breathing. And yet, most people who are bitten suffer no serious damage. But the bites that can be fatal are when children or older people are bitten. Once again, it's a spider that bites in self-defense, as does the brown widow. I mean, everybody hears about the black widow. What about the brown widow? It carries a whole batch of nasty venom too. But they rely on their webs to tell you that they're there. They haven't got particularly good eyesight, even though they've got all of those eyes. The brown widow spider bite looks horrific, like a massive pus under a huge boil. And yet, it'll cause muscle spasms, spinal paralysis, but that's usually temporary. And a serious bite would mean you've got to stay in hospital, but only, again, children, the elderly, or particularly ill people would die because of it. The next one is something that I have experienced big style. The brown recluse spider. Some people call them violin spiders, fiddlebacks in the southern states of America. They've got a dark kind of violin-shaped marking on their head. They're very slow and they hang around in dark, shadowy areas. People who live out in the country sometimes find them in shoes, clothing, or in your bed sheets especially. Wonder if there's any in your bed sheets. Might be worth having a look. I was filming a TV show in the southern states. I was actually on the outskirts of New Orleans, and they wanted me in a slave hut. The roof was off. You could see the moon through the open roof, and in the corner there was a massive cobwebs, and they wanted me to back into this corner where it would look like I was just stepping out of all this cobweb that attached itself to my long coat that I was wearing. And I did the whole piece to the camera, plugging the fact that tonight, live at 9 o'clock, we're going to be here at a plantation house and da-da-da. And once I'd finished the filming, they said, "Now, Alan, don't move." Now, nobody likes to hear that when you're in a dark corner surrounded by cobwebs. Don't move. Not a huge fan of spiders at the best of times. And they came over to me with hand brushes with long handles, and they said, "Turn around." I turned into the light, and they filmed the back of my coat, and I had about 70 of these things on. I had 4 of them on my head. So they brushed them all off, and then told me that if ever you're bitten by a black or brown recluse spider, they eat away at your flesh a little bit like Ebola. They cause your flesh unable to recover itself for months and months and months. Horrific pain, tissue loss is massive, horrendous infection, but once again, only children younger than 7 have ever died of it. If you go to South America, you've got to watch for what I think is the nastiest looking spider of all. If you haven't seen these things, look them up on the web. The 6-eyed sand spider. It's only about 1 to 2 inches long, but it can, with its legs, span out to about 4 inches. Found in deserts and sandy places in Africa and South America. Because of the way it walks, sometimes people call it a crab spider. And they have killed rabbits, and they have caused human beings to bleed profusely because you've got to burst the bite immediately to try and get the poison. Otherwise, your arm, the skin on your arm could die, suffer necrosis, and victims have died of hemorrhaging, a bit like a rattlesnake bite. It's particularly potent, and it causes a thinning of the blood and the total destruction of tissue. And the last one I'll mention is probably one you'll not come across, hopefully, unless you visit Chile. It's the Chilean recluse spider. Once again, those recluses, gotta watch them. And it's known as the corner spider. In South America, it's known as the arana de rincon, the corner spider. And others call it the harana marron, the brown spider. But it's dangerous. It causes your entire system to react, and it can lead to death. When you've been bitten by it, it looks almost like a bubblegum bubble on your arm. It's not particularly aggressive, so it doesn't come at you unless you invade where it happens to be. And a lot of these spiders have caused an awful lot of problems. There's the northern funnel web spider, one of the biggest in Australia, over 3 inches long. You usually see them falling into swimming pools. If they bite you, you just get 2 tiny little marks on your finger, and yet suddenly your finger starts to blow up. Finally, we're looking at insects. Now, I'm going to be fairly short and sharp with the insects because there is kind of a top 10 that most people quote. I shall share some of these with you, starting off with botflies. Now, the reason I mention this is because I can't think of anything nastier than flies laying their eggs in your arm so that all of their maggots are born inside your body and have to eat their way out. Now, if you go anywhere near the Mexican border in the US, or if you travel through South America in the rainforests, you got to be real careful if you've got a lump on you when you start heading towards the airport. We could also mention locusts. They don't kill you, but invasions of them have led to the starvation of millions in America, in Africa, and on the Asian continent. Then there's a thing called the giant Japanese hornet. 3 inches long. Think of how big 3 inches happens to be if you're talking wasp-like critter with a 1/2 inch sting. It carries so much toxin, it can lead to kidney failure, paralysis and death, and a slow, nasty death too. And they're attracted to people who drink alcohol, who have sweet BO, or people who are sweating and running. They will be attracted to you. Bees, Always been a bit of a fan of the humble bumble, but not all bees. There are Africanized killer bees, and they gather together and can wipe you out. They are spreading across Southern America, and they keep threatening to go into North America, but they've been held at bay. Mosquitoes we know about. We know that they can breed in any stagnant water that's left lying around. You've got to change your pet bowl daily if you live in hot temperatures. Change bird bath water frequently, otherwise mosquitoes will be around you, and they carry a whole range of life-threatening diseases. Fleas. Had a flea or two in me time, I'm ashamed to say. Usually off people's dogs, once off hedgehogs. Didn't think that was possible. But fleas, they have spread things like the Black Death, typhus, whole host of things on their own. They're just an itchy thing, but they can lead to nasty stuff too. There is a red and black bug known as the kissing bug, and you would think, oh, isn't that nice? The worst thing you can get is a bit of a snog, but it's actually a blood-sucking parasite that's attracted to where it eats by your breath. If you breathe through your mouth, you're a target, and if it bites you, it will leave a big lesion in your mouth or at the corner of your mouth, and it can leave life-threatening illnesses too. Fire ants, come across these once in New Orleans too. Once fell in a pit full of these things, and they bite before they even say hello. They give no mercy to anything that they lump on. You've got to get them off you as quick as you possibly can and get the hell away from them. They've been known to bring down horses and kill them with their toxin. Bullet ants, between 1 and 2 inch long ants. They say that being bitten by them, they're called bullet ants, because it feels like you're being shot. The pain is extreme. It can also lead you to paralysis. One of the people who's been bitten by them described it as walking over flaming charcoal with a 3-inch rusty nail in your foot. You don't mess about with the ant. And yet the worst one, I haven't mentioned yet, it's a thing called a driver ant. They never stop moving. They're always travelling, they're always looking for food, and they travel not in the 1,000 but in the 1,000,000. They flood the entire area. They've eaten dogs, cats, and children. And once there is an opening into the body, they will burrow their way in, and they will keep eating all of the time. The most commonly found in human areas, when a tethered animal, a dog or a cat or a cow, has not been able to get out the way of these things. Caged chickens and small children who are not capable of running faster than 1,000,000 or so driver ants. So that's what you got to worry about there. But what about that strange chasm between life and death? Let's get a grisly, ghostly tale or two. Now, if ever you've got a few days and we're able to travel ever again, of all of Europe's capital cities, there's no other that seem to be able to mix the shabby with the elegant like Dublin City does. The River Liffey meandering through a city of fabulous buildings side by side with industrial chimneys and the Guinness factory and all of that. One of the most imposing buildings that you see there is the Four Courts, it's known as. A big dome in the distance from the city centre, home of the city's judiciary, and also the home of a phantom. No one's really sure who it is, but he appears at the edge of the domed roof throughout the year, and people are always taking photographs and catching him too. Some say he's one of the men who actually built the Four Courts, who fell to his death, but there's actually no record of anything like that happening. Others say it's the hapless soul of a murderer sentenced to death in the 1920s for murdering a young girl from Carramo in Sligo. Whoever it is does make a point of being seen regularly. IRA leader Michael Collins came to Dublin in December 1921 to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty with Britain to give Ireland, excluding 6 of Ulster's 9 counties, its independence. And while he was there, he saw an apparition that he described as glowing yellow on top of the court building. At first I was blaming the drink because we'd been celebrating. I was not alone. Many others saw this sight too. I don't believe in ghosts, but what it was a mystery to me. If it was a ghost, perhaps it was the ghost of British colonialism laid to rest this fine day. Mrs. Rachel Piat from Roscommon visited Dublin in August 1936 for a second honeymoon to celebrate 15 years of marriage, and was walking along the River Liffey hand in hand with her husband Sean. He asked her to pause beside the end of the bridge so he could capture the mood of the magical moment. It was a misty night, warm and sticky, without any breeze. He aimed the camera at Rachel, tried to get in the bridge and the forecourt's dome in the distance, yet he could see a speck of light moving to and fro in his lens. He took the photograph and asked his wife to look at the dome, and there, on the very ledge that runs around the rim of the dome, they could see a luminous figure running back and forth. He seemed to be doing his utmost to attract attention. Sean took several photographs until the glowing figure ebbed away into nothing. 2 weeks later, the photographs were returned, and every shot came out perfectly, except those that featured the forecourt's building. They were all totally black. In January 1984, a student at a local college spotted a man on the dome of the forecourts and phoned the police, believing it was a would-be suicide. The police rushed out and saw the man sitting on the edge, dangling his legs over the side. On rushing to the top, they found there was no one there, and yet the people below could still see the man clearly. A nervous police officer walked along the edge round the dome, and although those on the ground could see both figures, the phantom was invisible to this intrepid policeman. Once he returned, trembling, to the street, he too could see the figure plainly. How do you explain things like that? Now let me take you back to the early 1600s. The church had been in receipt of a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which was essentially a book telling them how they had to get rid, murder that means, anyone who was a witch. A purge on witchcraft. Several hundred witches across Europe burned at the stake, most in Britain hanged or set on fire or allowed to burn to death in their homes. And yet most of those who died were little more than ordinary people with alternative ideas, women who could use herbs to cure people, farmers that used twigs and tree bark as an embrocation for horses, all described as heretic, all because the church wanted their money and their land and didn't care if they had to lose their life to get it. Now, anyone who was the slightest bit eccentric would be charged with heresy, an impossible charge to defend, and they would lose their lives. This made those who described themselves as real witches exit from any capital cities very swiftly indeed, and this included the sisters Gough, 4 women originally from Ireland who prayed to Satan. On the face of it, they did very little harm, being used as healers by many London folk, issuing a wide range of harmless herbal remedies. But their kindliness hid a dark side, and it took almost 30 years for people to uncover their secrets. Leaving London, they settled down in a small cottage at Blackheath near Guildford in Surrey. They were never fully accepted by the locals, but this didn't worry them. They had livestock, they could eke out a basic living from the land. In Guildford, many small children started disappearing, and a panic was spreading among parents throughout the county. Soldiers were even sent from London to try and make secure the Guildford streets. Once Guildford had its Clampdown. Then the children of Dorking were taken, and those from Godalming or Aldershot. In 1633, a boatload of men, women and children gathered to be sold into slavery abroad was found on the River Thames. On seizing it, the authorities thought they'd smashed a slavery ring that had robbed Surrey of many of its children. Whenever another youngster vanished, they blamed those accursed slavers. However, almost 30 years later, in 1658, the authorities decided to search Blackheath for the transvestite highwaywoman Moll Cutpurse. Her real name was Mary Frith, a London cobbler's daughter who, armed and dressed like a man, had been robbing rich and poor alike for over 50 years. She would die in 1658, aged 75. She left a book all about her amazing lifestyle, and she even had the effrontery to open a shop on London's Fleet Street, where those robbed often would buy their belongings back. While searching for this robber, soldiers burst into the Gough cottage and found the three women all standing naked in a tin bath, bathing in blood. The women, then in their 60s, ran for cover and tried to say that it was their blood. But on checking other rooms, the soldiers found the hacked-up bodies of several young children. Outside, in the vegetable patch, they uncovered hundreds of bones and found an outhouse stacked high with skulls, over 80 in number. The soldiers were after an aged robber. They found 3 mass child murderers instead. The 3 eventually claimed that bathing in blood kept them young, and indeed they did look half their actual ages. They were tried in Guildford, and such was the hatred of the townsfolk, they were carted off to Clandon Park to be burned to death. Long before the bonfires were ready, the public took control, hacking at them with axes, knives, hammers, pitchforks and scythes. The soldiers, only 10 in number, couldn't hope to defend the witches against such overwhelming odds, so they let the crowd have its way. Finally, the captain of the guard shouted, "To protect our children, these bodies must be burned." At that, the crowd began hurling the severed arms, legs and heads onto a fire. Soldiers dragging the bloody torsos that had also been kicked and stamped on so hard that the innards lay scattered far and wide. So died the witch's gough. They say that the spirits of the murderous sisters still float along Guildford's fine streets in search of more young virgin blood. Don't forget, we have endless adventures for you to share on robsonsworld.com, and there is a book out that you may fancy if you so desire, called Grisly Tales from Northumbria, and that's available on Northern Heritage or your local Amazon sites. However, I'm sending you to Coventry now, because in 1777, Jacques Theodore was released from a Coventry prison after spending 8 years in a stinking cell for a crime he certainly never committed. He'd been charged with attacking a young woman from Canley Ford. He was found guilty and he was imprisoned. 3 days after his trial, the girl, an amateur whore called Nell Vaughan, openly boasted how she'd got that Frenchie put away. There was a tremendous anti-French feeling in England at that time, and all that Theodore had done was to refuse to purchase Nell's sexual services. While in prison, in a cell shared by 11 other criminals, rapists, murderers, arsonists, thieves, cutthroats, the Frenchman, being small in stature, had his teeth knocked out, and he'd been so savagely buggered by many of his cellmates. To survive 8 years in prison was a rarity in itself in those days, as Coventry jail at that time was riddled with disease, riddled with vermin, and one night the Frenchman woke up to find the man in the next bunk to his left being eaten alive by hundreds of rats that were ripping away at his flesh. 2 of the other prisoners woke too, tried to help him, but the rats were utterly relentless, and eventually over the course of the next 4 days, stripped the man to the bone. The other prisoners hid the death for a month, using it as a way to get more food and water. They were eating his share, and some say they'd eaten a little of him too. At last, Theodore was finally released, a shadow of the man he'd formerly been. Whenever he went in Coventry, he was shunned, for he was that foreigner who'd raped an English girl. Despite his innocence, he was unable to find work to raise money, so he couldn't return home to Lille in France. His frustration finally got the better of him. He kidnapped Nell, the woman who'd put him away, at sword point, and marched her to the local magistrate. There, he ordered her to tell the truth, and this she did. And then he struck her with the sword in the back and watched as she slowly bled to death. No matter how long she suffered, it wouldn't add up to the terrible indignities that he had undergone in that scruffy cell. The magistrate swore that if he gave up his sword, he would get a fair trial. Now, another trial was the last thing that Theodore wanted. Instead, he placed his arm on a table, and with his right hand he swung down his sword, severing his other arm just below the elbow. As the Frenchman staggered around with his sword, he flicked the arm at the petrified magistrate. To his horror, the severed arm climbed up his nightshirt, leaving a trail of bloody gore behind it. On reaching the throat of the old man, he claimed that it clenched tightly, squeezing the life out of him. Soon, the Frenchman was marching down the street, cursing everyone who approached him and swinging his sword around his head, blood spurting from his ghastly stump. And his head began to swim. He swiftly lost strength. He knew he had to end his life, or he would certainly be placed back in prison or face the gallows. So there in Coventry he stood on Swanswell Street, overlooking the lake. He balanced the sabre on its hilt, and he fell onto the blade. He managed to struggle back to his feet and took a couple of shaky paces, only to fall face first into the chilly water. The arm was never found, and that detached arm is said still to haunt Coventry, creeping up ladies' bedspreads late in the night, stroking their cheeks. If the woman awakes, she sees it for a second, and then it disappears. And let's end our grisly tales with a story of a vampire, a very real vampire. Anybody interested in the folklore of Dorset will know of Doggett's corpse, of which several stories exist, and I'm not going to apologise for picking the goriest. In the small village of Tarrant Gunville stands a fine house called Eastbury, once one of the most sought-after residences in all of England. And it was there that a squint-eyed man called William Doggett worked as a steward. His duties included preparing the master's clothes, making sure the horses were ready, and generally acting as a non-military batman. Living in such a fine house gave him considerable standing in the community and opened many a lady's bedroom door. But Doggett was a sluggish man, his shoulders always hanging forward limply as he slouched his way around the county. He was well known for having no sense of humour at all, once thrashing a young boy who hit his leg with a snowball. He used to visit the local inn, sitting quietly by the open fire of an evening, spending all night over one foaming tankard of ale. In 1827, the first body was found in a copse of trees near Shroton. The corpse was that of a young servant girl from the inn. Her clothes had been removed and her stomach was ripped open. Some maniac had not only dragged her insides out of her body, but teeth marks could clearly be seen on her liver. There were many bloody footprints that seemed to lead back to Sutton Waldron, so a full search was carried out in that area. Nothing was found. But later that same year, a 6-year-old girl was discovered in Ashmore, stripped naked and impaled on the branch of a tree. Part of the flesh from her arm had been eaten away, and her eyes had been removed. Quite understandably, everyone was terrified, and when a madman was captured in Shaftesbury nearby, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, believing him to have been this crazy cannibal killer. But the strange deaths continued. A 75-year-old lady was found dead in her bed at Spetisbury. She was known to be frail, so her death would have been no big surprise to the locals, except that the artery in her neck was severed, and yet there was no sign of any blood. Not in her, not on her, and not around her. The lady was found with the knife in her hand, but where was the blood? The authorities dismissed this, but locals believed there was a vampire on the loose, and it had drank the old lady's juice. Between 1827 and 1843, there were 11 other strange incidents, yet each one was close enough to being a natural death to avoid any major investigation. A woman was found with slashed wrists in a cattle trough, yet there was very little blood found. The would-be coroner explained this was due to the coldness of the water on a February morning. 2 toddlers were found dead at the bottom of a hill near Ibberton. Their skulls were both smashed, yet their brains were never found. Once again, a reason was given. In this case, it was suggested foxes must have fed on the youngsters' bodies. Teeth marks were found, but they looked human, not canine. There was little doubt that the area had a serious problem. These events always took place late at night and always had a hint of cannibalism about them. It was then that fate took charge and brought the matter to a temporary close, for William Doggett was called upon to drive his master's coach to Southampton on business. The job was done, and they returned to find that a maid had entered Doggett's quarters, where she had found a chest full of gold and silver goblets, silverware, and some of the master's less well-used jewellery. Doggett was told that he was sacked, and the master summoned soldiers to arrest him and hold him. It was then that Doggett took a gun, placed it in his mouth, and literally blew his brains all over the study wall. There were no further murders or mysterious deaths for 2 years. Then, in 1845, a teenage girl from Witchhampton disappeared, only to be found on Gaunt's Common, stripped and impaled on a fence post. She was pale and gaunt, and despite such a horrific wound, there was little or no blood. Some of the locals believed it was still Doggett rising from his grave to continue his bloody vampiric deeds. So on a wet and windy autumn evening, they gathered at the graveyard with shovels in hand, ready to finally destroy this monster. As they hacked away at the sodden earth, the wind made the church bell clang away as if summoning the dead to mass. Their shovels struck wood, and they began clearing the top of the steward's coffin. They hacked off the brass locks that were still firmly fastened, and the coffin opened with one of those unnerving creaks that you only ever really hear in an episode of Scooby-Doo. As they shone their lantern on the body, they all recoiled in horror. Daggett's body, 2 years in the ground, was rosy-cheeked and flushed with blood, and a tiny dribble of it trickled from his lips, and it was still wet. Some say A stake was hammered through his heart, others that they hacked his body to pieces with their shovels. Another version of this story tells of how one of the men, believed to be the father of the tragic Witchhampton girl, took a hatchet and chopped off Doggett's head, weighing it down with rocks and hurling it into the River Stout. Holy water was thrown on the rest of the cadaver, and the coffin was sealed again and then covered with heavy rocks so that the creature could not rise again. This put an end to the adventures of the Dorset vampire. Or did it? They say that on the anniversary of Doggett's death, a phantom coach arrives at the door of Eastbury, rattling its way across the old cattle grill. It's driven by a headless coachman, believed to be all that was left of Doggett after the locals had done with him. Well, a mixture of grisly tales. I hope you enjoyed them. We'll be back with more. Spread the word of the owl. Lots of different things coming your way across the year. I hope you'll stay with me. From me, Alan Robson, bless you, and I wish you well.